Nathan was a 40-year-old bachelor who immersed himself in work after his girlfriend's betrayal. Upon returning from the army many years ago, he discovered that Kylie, a sweet and modest girl who promised to wait faithfully and quietly, cried, confessing her eternal love, had married Nathan's best friend, and the couple were already expecting their first child. Although it's a banal story that has happened countless times, Nathan could no longer open his heart to anyone. He was sure that Kylie was not like everyone else and would surely be faithful, but he was wrong. Since then he had no faith in female loyalty. Nathan sometimes met with charming girls, pleasant to talk to, and spent time with them, but their relationship never went beyond casual meetings. He decided that he would become successful and wealthy, and then Kylie would see what she missed out on. But when his business started going well, and a whirlpool of important matters took over, he completely forgot about his first love. Now all his thoughts were occupied by business deals, meetings, and new projects. However, Kylie knew about Nathan's successes from mutual acquaintances and tried to arrange meetings with him. A couple of times, when she did arrange them, she flirted and said how deeply she regretted not being able to see his potential and missing out on such a man. However, Nathan was not touched by her words at all. On the contrary, it was even unpleasant for him to hear them from someone he once considered a modest innocent. For him, she was just like many others from now on. Things were going quite successfully in Nathan's company, and he didn't need anything else in life. Only sometimes, looking out of the window of his spacious apartment into the street, he envied the proud fathers walking with their little ones. But then, once again, he remembered how painful it was, and told himself that his fate was entirely different. Who knows if he would have achieved such heights if he had tied his life with Kylie? Or maybe he would now be working as a fitter or a turner at a factory, coming back home tired, where screaming children and an angry wife demanding money were waiting for him. No, he was clearly just lucky. This is how Nathan comforted himself every time thoughts of family weighed on his soul. He was engaged in the sale of building materials, had a network of stores throughout the city with products for apartment renovation, and recently opened a small factory for the production of some construction materials. Of course, the main thing in his business is to increase the clientele, and here Nathan was lucky. Mrs. Lane had been working as a customer relations manager for him for 5 years. A woman of retirement age, but very competent and a true professional. Moreover, she was distinguished by enviable sociability and could find a common language with literally every person. Some of Nathan's acquaintances tried to lure Mrs. Lane to their company. Some were surprised that a businessman kept such an elderly employee, but Nathan believed that these people were simply envious of him. He himself was confident that the success of his company depended largely on the efforts of Mrs. Lane, and of course he sometimes wondered what would happen when the woman wanted to leave her job. But it turned out that he fired Mrs. Lane himself, and much earlier. His former classmate, who was now a government official, asked Nathan to hire his niece, Zoe, instead of Mrs. Lane. Nathan probably would have refused right away, but Patrick managed to present his request appropriately. He came to the office of his former classmate with a bottle of expensive cognac and brought along the very Zoe. The girl looked like she had come straight out of a glossy magazine. Slender, long-legged, with a full chest and luxurious blonde hair. In addition, she had several diplomas. She was both an accountant and a customer relations manager, and had studied business etiquette. Customers will flock to such a beauty like bees to honey, even just to see her again, Patrick argued, and he managed to persuade Nathan who promised Zoe the desired position. The only thing that bothered him was the unpleasant conversation he had to have with Mrs. Lane, but Nathan could not even imagine how difficult it would be. The woman had done nothing wrong, not even worthy of a reprimand. She had always worked impeccably. So when the boss called her in and without preamble announced her dismissal, she could not believe what was happening and kept asking what had happened and what she was guilty of. He lied to her that he cared about her health, and it was time for her to go for a well-deserved rest. Mrs. Lane turned pale and asked for water. Then she begged to be allowed to stay in the company as a janitor at least, but Nathan refused. He did not want to see Mrs. Lane, a highly professional specialist, with a mop and bucket every day. It would only remind him that he had acted low and unfairly. Besides, Mrs. Lane would see the new employee and understand that she had been fired only because she was inferior to Zoe in terms of appearance. After hearing the refusal, Mrs. Lane did not ask for anything else, nor did she insist on anything. Nathan indirectly feared that she would go to court and tried to soften his decision, which was so painful for the woman. "Mrs. Lane, you are already on a well-deserved retirement. Live for yourself. As far as I know, you have a good pension, and we will also give you a bonus for years of impeccable service." The woman just waved her hand desperately. After that, she quickly gathered her things and left. This happened on Friday, and on Monday, Zoe replaced Mrs. Lane in the office. Nathan saw that the new employee was trying hard, but not everything was going well for her. He had to explain a lot to her, and it turned out that she was not used to working so much. Mrs. Lane could easily stay after work if it was convenient for a client to come to their company in the evening. For Zoe, the need to sacrifice her personal time turned out to be an unpleasant surprise. Every free minute she tried to spend on herself. She would start painting her nails, then choose a blouse online, then chat on the phone with someone. Sales had begun to decline noticeably. Nathan had already made remarks to Zoe more than once, but when he entered the office, she smiled enchantingly at him, and her neckline was so revealing that he involuntarily bit his tongue. Several months passed. One day, Nathan took home to sort out some critical documents. When he came out of the entryway the next morning with his briefcase, hooligans suddenly ran up to him and started beating him. They were tall and strong and wore hooded jackets. Nathan didn't have time to examine their faces because he immediately fell. In his heart, Nathan hoped that the thugs would take his wallet with the money and leave. But the guys didn't limit themselves to the pack of bills they found on him. They also grabbed his briefcase and then fled. Nathan tried to get up, feeling for his glasses on the asphalt. Suddenly, he heard a male scream. "Oh, damn it!" Then came the sound of falling. Finally, putting on his glasses, Nathan saw that one of his attackers apparently slipped on something while running under the arch, and now his injured leg was making it difficult for him to rise. And the other bandit was hit on the head by a woman in a scarf and a cotton jacket. Nathan could not believe his eyes. Meanwhile, the woman hurried to him. "Nathan, are you okay? Let me call an ambulance," a familiar voice said, and he recognized Mrs. Lane. "Mrs. Lane, but how did you manage?" he could only ask. Mrs. Lane smiled. "As soon as I noticed they start beating you, I was confused at first, but I immediately called security, and then I saw these scoundrels were running in my direction. Well, I threw the bucket at their feet. One of them stumbled over it, and the second, I have already given a bottle on the head. I don't even know how I had the courage. And now, you're..." Nathan looked at his former colleague, saw that she had lost a lot of weight, and her clothes were strange. "I work as a janitor now," said Mrs. Lane. "But why? Isn't your pension enough?" Nathan blushed. "I really need the money," explained Mrs. Lane without going into details. And then the security arrived. Nathan did not let the matter slide. If the robbers had only taken his wallet, there would be no questions. But they had clearly needed the documents in his portfolio for a reason. Nathan hired a private detective and spared no expense for the investigation. When he learned the results, he was shocked. It turned out that his old friend, who was the mayor's right-hand man, was behind the whole plot. Together with his relative, Patrick, he wanted to deprive Nathan of his company, which brought in large profits. Naturally, Nathan immediately showed Zoe the door. The girl tried to justify herself, pretending that she was in no way involved in all this and had no idea about her uncle's plans. But Nathan warned her she should be glad that he decided not to take the matter to court. After that, he went to Mrs. Lane's house. He wanted to ask for forgiveness and invite the woman back to work. Nathan brought a bottle of good wine, a luxurious bouquet of roses, and compensation for moral damage in an envelope. Mrs. Lane lived nearby, but she was not at home. Nathan pressed the doorbell for a long time and was about to leave when he heard someone respond, "Wait, I'll open it now." A few minutes later the door opened. A young woman in a wheelchair stood before Nathan. In the semi-darkness of the hallway, he did not immediately make out her face. "Sorry for making you wait," she apologized. "I didn't think anyone would come today, so I was in bed. It took me a while to get dressed and make it to the door." "You forgive me?" Nathan stuttered. "I dropped in uninvited to see Mrs. Lane, but I see she is not at home. Mum will be here soon from her second job." "Can I wait for her?" "Of course, I'll put the kettle on, and you can go to the living room." While the girl was busy in the kitchen, Nathan sat in an armchair and looked around. He knew that Mrs. Lane was receiving a good salary, but her home environment was poor, if not downright impoverished. The furniture was probably 20 years old, painted wooden floors. However, the house was impeccably clean. That was immediately noticeable. Suddenly, Nathan wondered how the girl would manage by herself in the kitchen and rushed in to help her. They introduced themselves to each other. The girl's name was Amy, and Nathan noticed that she was beautiful, but very skinny and pale. They had just sat down to have tea when Mrs. Lane returned. Upon seeing her former boss, she couldn't hide her surprise. "Nathan? It's the first time you're visiting me. What brings you here?" Nathan confusedly began to mumble something unintelligible, but Mrs. Lane understood that he was asking for forgiveness. "Oh, come on," she waved her hand. "It's obvious to me. Any man would prefer a younger, more beautiful woman than an old maid like me. And there wouldn't have to be any problem if she had been a good specialist instead of a mediocre fraudster." Nathan sighed. "You see how fate has taught me a lesson. I could have easily lost everything. And I already lost a lot when I fired you. Clients started leaving, revenues were falling. I would really like if you came back, if of course you forgive me." Mrs. Lane looked him straight in the eye. "Honestly, I don't know what to say, Nathan. My daughter Amy has serious problems with her spine. Everything I earned always went towards her treatment. Sometimes it wasn't enough and I had to take out loans. I'm still paying off one now. I know I can work as a janitor or a cleaner as much as my strength allows. No one will fire me. But in your and other companies, it's a real swing. One day you're valued, the next day you're kicked out for nothing. I can't afford all these ups and downs." Perhaps Nathan had never been so ashamed in his life. "Please, think about it some more," he asked Mrs. Lane. And with that he bowed and left. In the next few days he paid off Mrs. Lane's loan to the bank, asking that his name not be revealed to her, just some benefactor who wanted to do a good deed. He also found a clinic where Amy was being treated, talked to the doctors. She needed an expensive operation. If it went well, Amy would almost certainly be able to walk again. Nathan said that there was no need to wait for quotas. He would pay for everything. He found out the details and wrote a check for the necessary amount. On the same day, Mrs. Lane called him. She could not hide her tears of happiness, as she understood who played the role of the benefactor. Mrs. Lane reported that she would stay with Amy for the first time after the surgery, and as soon as her daughter felt better, she would immediately start working. The operation was successful. Nathan often visited the woman in the clinic, brought her flowers and fruits, and rejoiced that everything was going well. He himself did not notice that he was becoming increasingly attached to Amy, and his heart quickly opened up to this cute, modest, and smart woman. He stayed in the ward for a long time, talking about all sorts of nonsense like a schoolboy in love. When Amy began to get up and take her first timid steps, Nathan was always there to support her. On the day when Amy was discharged from the clinic, Nathan proposed to her, and the girl replied with consent. They had a modest wedding, as the bride still had a long period of rehabilitation ahead of her. Instead of a honeymoon, the young couple went to a good sanatorium in Germany. Mrs. Lane no longer worked as a cleaner, but returned to the company she had put so much effort into. She not only negotiated with the most important clients, but also taught young managers this art. Getting knowledge at the university is one thing, but practice is quite another. Nathan kept his word and never went to court against Patrick. However, a few months later the official was dismissed from his post, and a criminal case was opened against him for another reason. He had too much debt and had to return the money to very serious people. Patrick was an avid gambler and spent any amount that came into his hands. To pay off, he was even ready to commit a crime. It didn't work out with Nathan. He got into the state treasury, took out what did not belong to him. Soon Patrick was tried, given a sentence, and his property was confiscated. Zoe now had to seriously look for a job. Fortunately, some kind-hearted acquaintance placed her in the accounting department of an enterprise. But in the woman's team, the girl's charms could no longer interest anyone. Nathan told his wife and mother-in-law about all this over dinner, and then apologized again to Mrs. Lane.